They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I always thought that sounded bitter. What I discovered is that success tastes better, served on a silver platter with a quiet napkin over it. Today, I live on the edge of a small lake, the kind that turns gold in the evening and hushes the world. I have a garden that refuses to quit, and a company that, on paper, is worth more than I ever dared to imagine when I was folding sympathy cards in my kitchen 5 years ago. Most people don't know the middle of the story, though. They only see the old woman on the porch, the lake, the neat truck in the driveway. They don't see the iPad after midnight, the U-Haul boxes, or the way a courthouse photo on Facebook can land like a fist in your chest. If you like stories about reinvention, hit subscribe. There are a lot of them here, and honestly, I could have written a book. Let me take you back to September 2019. I was 67 then. David and I had been married 42 years. 42 years of grocery lists, of Saturdays in the garage, of his laugh coming from a recliner at the end of a long day. We had the kind of life that felt immovable. Fridge magnets from every vacation, a stack of Christmas cards with the kids' handwriting preserved in the same shoebox. We weren't flashy. We were steady. I liked steady. The message came in the small hours. My phone was on the charger. My iPad, the one I kept by my chair for crossword puzzles and the odd recipe, chimed with the kind of sound that makes your stomach drop when you know it's not a sales alert. Linda had sent me a screenshot from Facebook. It was Pamela's profile, a courthouse selfie, her arm looped with someone who wasn't me. Pamela, my Pamela, smiled like she had for years at book club, at our charity bake sale, at the summer picnic where she and I had compared notes on lemon bars. The caption was trimmed down, just 2 words, married. Underneath, the comments were what you would expect. Congratulations, love you both. But what caught me was a small private message thread visible in the screenshot. There was a thin edge of betrayal, crisp and unnatural. I didn't scream, I didn't throw anything. I read it twice, then 3 times, as if repetition could soften the sentence carved into my night. When David came to bed, I had the iPad on my lap like a strange talisman. The house smelled of his Old Spice and the faint, oily tang of the garage. I remember the hum of the refrigerator, the sound my life made when it was still a machine I understood. I woke him gently, because that's what you do when you've been married as long as we had. He sat up, fumbled for the light, and the look on his face when he saw the screenshot was the first time I understood what the word confession tasted like. He didn't hesitate. There was a thinness to his voice that I have heard only twice in my life, in the hospital, and now. He told me it was true. He told me there had been someone else. He told me the name as if saying it aloud might make it less real, and then he said it again, this time softer, like a confession to a priest. Pamela. There are moments in life when all the air leaves the room. My vision narrowed to the small square of the iPad, to the outline of his hand in the lamplight. I asked him how long. He said it had been a while. I asked him if he loved her. He didn't answer cleanly. There was a fumbling, the clumsy grammar of someone trying to break a thing he had cherished because he had found something easier to admire from a distance. He packed a bag that night. There were U-Haul boxes within a week. I remember the dull thunk of cardboard, the tape blades scraping against skin, the precise, ordinary sounds of unmaking a life. When your marriage ends in the early hours of a cool September night, and there's no dramatic scene on the porch, the world still goes on. Leaves fell, the mail arrived, the kids called. I don't know why I thought it would be different. Perhaps because I'd never once pictured my life without him. I used to rehearse small arguments about nothing, a kind of private theater where the stakes were low and the ending secure. Suddenly, the script had been ripped up. Jennifer, Michael, and Amy were my north. They came as storms and as lighthouses, text messages at 2 a.m., a key on my kitchen counter, a car pulling up spontaneously. They were practical in the way children of long marriages learn to be. My daughter went through my jewelry box and pulled out the ring he had given me when I was 30. She said, with a steadiness that surprised me, "Mom, you can live your life without him." It was the simplest, truest thing they could do for me. The ache didn't leave. It shifted. Pain became a kind of ballast. There was a moment I will never forget. The day I decided to tell Richard. Richard had been Pamela's husband, or had been. It's complicated when 2 lives cross in messy ways. I had known Richard in the peripheral way you know your neighbor's name and the color of their mailbox.
He was quieter, the kind of man who preferred to putter with a bonsai outside than to make a scene. When he learned what had happened, he showed up at my door with a thermos of coffee and a bag of burnt cookies he claimed were an experiment. He sat on my porch stoop, and we didn't talk about Pamela at first. We talked about the small humiliations of growing older, about his garden, my failed lemon bars, and the way a certain song would always bring him back to his wife's laugh. There was tenderness in his presence that had nothing to do with romance. He was, in that moment, a fellow casualty of something beyond both of us. I could see the lines around his mouth deepen when he smiled. I could see the way grief looked on someone who had not expected to be bereft. We compared notes on the oddness of life, how brittle the everyday can become when the foundation shifts. There was no cabal of revenge.
There was coffee and conversation and the odd relief that comes from not being the only person awake at midnight staring at the ceiling. One late night, after a storm had washed the leaves clean and the sky had the kind of cold clarity that makes a person speak plainly, Richard said something I'd been thinking and didn't know how to say. He sat back in my kitchen chair, the one with a small chip on the arm, and said, "If we had a place for people's stories, real stories, the ones that don't make it into obituary blurbs, would anyone come?" It was a question that seemed to come out of nowhere, and yet it fit into my mouth like a key. We'd both been watching the way families around us handled photographs and neglected shoeboxes of pictures. We had seen people with decades of memories stored in modest attics, photographs curling on one side, slides tucked into envelopes, stories vaporizing because no one had asked them the right questions. I thought of Dorothy. Dorothy was an 84-year-old woman I met at the community center where I volunteered, a spry soul with fingernails painted the color of strawberries. She had a stack of loose photos and a tremor in her hand when she showed them to me. She wanted, with a desperation that made her eyes bright and wet, to do something with them before it's too late. She wanted a book, she said, a book that a grandchild could open and hear her voice. Her voice came in fragments, and when she told me about the man in the second photo, the one with the bow tie, her smile ran all the way through and left a warmth behind. We sat at her kitchen table with a tape recorder and a thermos of instant coffee and recorded stories that were at once ordinary and miraculous. She told me about the way she learned to knit from her mother, about the time she got lost on a bus at 15 and ended up at a dance, about the soup that always made the neighbor come by. When we made the book for her, hand-bound with faded photographs carefully scanned and captions that tried to catch the song of her life, she cried when she turned the first page. Her hands shook as she smiled at her younger self, and she said in a voice that had the texture of a lifetime, "This is who I was." It was as if the book had remembered her in a way people sometimes fail to do. That first book cost me nothing but time. It cost Dorothy enough to pay for 2 boxes of archival paper and a few hours of my own. I left her house on a bright November day with a sense that we had done something small and enormous at once. Richard had been there, helping with the scans, holding the tape recorder steady so Dorothy could rest her hands. We stood in his driveway afterwards and looked at the trunk of the car where he'd piled the boxes, and we laughed in that quiet, relieved way that people laugh when something fearful has been transformed. "People would pay for this," he said then, "not because it's a product, but because it's a service.
Because someday someone will want to hear Dorothy's voice, and they won't be able. They'll pay to keep that." I didn't think of profit in those days. I thought of the work, of sitting with someone and giving them permission to matter. But the idea took a hold of me like a weed in spring. We began to talk about structure, what we'd call it, how we'd reach people, what it would cost to buy a proper scanner instead of using the community centers. Richard had a knack for logistics. I had a way with people. We were opposite sides of an odd coin. My brain found the stories, his found a way to pay for the tissue paper. We called it Legacy Memories because it felt honest and small and true. The first years of anything are always the lean ones. Our very first client, Dorothy, stayed the first advocate. She told her friends and they told theirs. We had no office in the beginning, just my kitchen table, a stack of archival boxes in the garage, and a binder where we logged names and dates, and the odd fact that made each person's story unique. We brought in a young designer named Marcus after one of those awkward nights when you realize you cannot, in fact, be the person who does everything. Marcus was 26, a bright kid with a queer haircut and a taste for fonts that made me squint. He showed up on a cold spring morning with a portfolio and an energy that felt like currency. He taught us how a layout could be more than decoration. It could be a frame for memory. There were mistakes, so many mistakes. We learned that scanners are picky, that some people don't like their memories edited, that the process of permission can take months. We learned to be patient with family disagreements over captions, to steer conversations away from bitterness. Richard and I made a pact early on. This business would not be a place for retribution. It would be a place for preservation. That promise kept us from sinking back into something small and mean. The numbers started like a slow turn. Our first year, with 3 part-time helpers and many borrowed card tables, we pulled in $180,000 in revenue. It felt like more than that when you were the one paying the utilities. We reinvested everything. We bought a better scanner, then a second. We rented a small office above a dentist practice that smelled perpetually of mint. The first year was a blur of plates of takeout, late nights designing layouts, and the stubborn, softening look I began to get when a client leafed through their finished book and said, "I didn't realize that I had that life." Word spread in small channels, church bulletins, a segment on the local morning show, an article in the senior living newsletter that quoted Dorothy and used one of her photos. The community liked the idea of giving their elders a voice. Families wanted to do something before things became impossible. Marcus, still a kid, still laughing at fonts, became indispensable.
He brought in templates, a social media account, a way of making our work look professional without losing warmth. There was an odd inversion in my identity that I didn't expect. The woman who had been left was turning into a woman who asked other people to tell their stories. The one who had her own life disrupted was now the keeper of other people's histories. Slowly, the resentment around being abandoned reframed itself into a professional focus. I found that when I asked someone about the color of the curtains in a summer kitchen or the dish they made for holidays, the conversation moved like a balm across the places where hurt used to live. I was becoming useful in a way that felt clean. Not everyone was kind. A few acquaintances whispered, people who had always spoken in the soft, lateral ways of small towns. There was the occasional barbed question from someone who wanted to measure my pain like a spectacle. I handled it the only way I could, by turning attention to the work. There is a dignity in productivity. I didn't mean to make my life into a parade, but there is a kind of healing that comes when your hands are busy in public ways. My children called less about the sting and more about scheduling. They liked the fact that I was building something. In year 2, we tripled that first revenue, about $650,000. The growth wasn't overnight. It was a slow accretion of trust. We hired more staff, trained archivists who understood when to let a silence linger and when to prod gently. We started to work with small assisted living facilities nearby, hosting workshops where people brought shoeboxes and we walked them to cataloging. Often the workshop would descend in laughter and then to a sudden communal silence as someone told a secret story. Those silences are the work. They are where the real exchange happens. The local paper did a feature one autumn and the story landed strange places. A radio host called. A producer from a regional television show asked if one of our books could be displayed. Suddenly, there were more requests than we could handle. We rented a 10,000 square foot space, an industrial loft with high windows that let in a river of light, and we converted half of it into digitization stations and the other half into a binding room where hands could stitch and glue in an old-fashioned way. The space smelled of paper, glue, and coffee, and it felt like a chapel for memory. There is a cruelty in small-town gossip and a generosity in strangers. Both showed up. Pamela and David's faces floated back into my life like weather. I saw them at the grocery store once, a strange echo of the past, and their cart skidded in another aisle. Pamela posted the courthouse photo as if it were a trophy, and then months later a photo of a kitchen with peeling paint, and a caption about starting over. I heard through mutual friends that things weren't smooth. That was not my concern. I had promised myself I would not build my life on the idea of making them suffer. It felt petty and brittle, and I had seen the kind of person I didn't want to be in the mirror too often to indulge in that. There were evenings, especially the first winter, when the loneliness returned like a fog, and I walked the dock and counted the stars, thinking about how intimate a human heart can be with routine. The lake would be a black mirror,
And sometimes I'd imagine everything being exactly as it had been, as if I could fold time from the middle and make it straight. But then the phone would ring with someone asking if we could digitize a box of letters, and the routine of work would push the fog away. The business was more than profit. It was a reason to be present in other people's endings and beginnings. I met Dorothy's granddaughter once. She hugged me so tightly that for a second she felt like a child. She told me how the book had changed family dinners, how they brought it out and read a page when someone felt lost. You can't buy that kind of currency. We had, slowly and unexpectedly, created a small ripple in our community. It felt holy in a way that hadn't in years. One afternoon, a woman from a regional senior living corporation emailed me. She had seen a segment and wanted to know if we could partner to provide services across multiple facilities. I read the email twice, my hand shaking, and then had to set the phone down. The idea of scaling, of taking something intimate and making it accessible in many rooms, was both terrifying and exhilarating. Richard, who had developed a reassuring habit of saying practical things when I got dreamy, sat across from me and said, "If they want it, we have to make sure the work holds up when more people touch it." We were, at that point, still in the phase where everything seemed possible, and also improbably precarious. There were nights of planning with old-school yellow pads, nights of pages of flowcharts that led nowhere until they converged into a plan. We began to map out how to handle dozens of clients, how to train teams to ask the hard questions without turning into interrogators, how to keep the humanity even with an increase in volume. We began to price packages. We had meetings about shipping and about the weight of boxes when you have to store hundreds. And there was a new wrinkle in our lives I hadn't expected: the way people watched. Success, even small success, is a magnet. My phone, once a silent tool for grocery lists, began to ring with requests from news shows and podcasts. I would not have asked for that attention 5 years earlier, but I learned to accept it as a way to get more books into the hands of people like Dorothy. There was always tension. How much exposure is too much? I decided the answer was enough to let more people know they could be remembered.
Evening would come and I would sit on the back stoop, the same stoop that had known my grief, and think about the odd turn life had taken. To say that making books healed me would be overstating. There were nights I still peeled back the bandage and found the raw place under. There were moments of jealousy, of imagining Pamela smiling in a new kitchen, of wondering what I had done wrong. But these were moments. They no longer dictated the story. I remember a particular night, late winter, where the cold cut through the light and the office smelled like ink and coffee. Marcus had stayed late to finish a layout, a montage of a family through decades, and Richard was on the phone trying to negotiate a contract for a local retirement community that had asked for a pilot. I sat at my desk, hands folded to keep them warm, and thought about the courthouse photo that had started this whole chain. The photo that had hurt me also prompted me to build something that let other people hold on to what mattered. There is a line people like to draw between victimhood and agency, as if they exist in separate rooms. They don't. They are often two states of being in the same life. I was both the woman who had been left and the woman who became a steward of memory. Somewhere along the way, I learned not to let the one define the other. When the inquiries started to multiply, we celebrated quietly. We had a cake, nothing fancy, a supermarket lemon cake that I iced myself, and for a few hours we were ordinary and delicious. I tried the cake and thought about Dorothy turning a page and finding her voice. I tried the cake and thought about my kids, who had learned to use their hands to build rooms and futures for me when I had needed it. I tried the cake and thought, not vindictively, but simply and with an odd lightness, they didn't see this coming. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like reclamation. There is a dignity in turning a rupture into work that gives people something lasting. We weren't trying to humiliate anyone. We were trying to be better than smallness. That has always felt like the right kind of triumph to me. The winter passed into spring and the pilot projects began. We sat with residents in dining rooms that smelled of soup, with hands that trembled and eyes that shone when a son would bring a photograph. We learned how to create a process that honored the person before the product. We learned how to train our staff to keep compassion at the center and to let the work be measured by the tenderness of the results rather than by profit alone. One day, an email arrived with a subject line I will never forget. It was from the corporate office of a senior living chain, a place I had never imagined would write to me. The email asked if I could provide a quote for a 3-year pilot across facilities in our state. I read it twice. I put the phone down. I read it again. Then I called Richard.
Do you want to keep going?
I asked him, like a child seeking permission to jump off a high place. He laughed, a small, relieved sound, and said, I don't want to say no. We worked through the numbers, the schedules, the staff training. We made lists of risks and created templates that allowed for customization. We mapped how to scale care without losing the intimacy that made the work matter. There were late nights of spreadsheets and negotiation, of learning vocabulary that did not come naturally to either of us. There were moments of doubt. There were moments of pure joy. When I look back, sitting here in this house, the lake in front of me and a contract that would later be called The Turning Point in my lap like a story I've told 1,000 times, I see that the turning point was not a sudden flash. It was the accumulation of quiet, faithful steps. It was Dorothy saying, "This is who I was," and it was Richard handing me a thermos of coffee and listening. It was Marcus staying late to perfect a layout, and my children folding boxes for shipment because they knew how much it mattered to me. At 72, I can say this without the need to sharpen the memory. The contract, when it arrived, was not a headline for humiliation. It was a chance to do the work on a larger scale. It was, in its way, a vindication of the ethic we had built. Preserve with care, listen with patience, and never make someone's story into a billboard. They didn't see the contract coming, and that is part of the sweet surprise, but I will tell you more about that later. For now, it's enough to say that what began as 2 people with a tape recorder and a thermos of coffee grew into something that required more than sentiment. It required systems, courage, and the slow accumulation of trust. It required that I stop letting the question, "Why me?" circle like a gull, and instead ask the question, "What now?" The answer was a business, a community, a life that gave me tasks to wake up for and people to meet every day who needed to be remembered. I am telling you this because I want you to see the path, messy, practical, and full of small miracles. There is no single moment when I decided to become successful. There was instead a series of small decisions, to show up, to listen, to let pain be a teacher, not an architect of my future. Those are the choices you can make tomorrow if you need to. A week after that first corporate email, a recruiter called from a regional charity looking for a consultant. A producer wanted footage for a short piece. A woman in Florida wanted to know if we could preserve her father's letters. Small tasks multiplied. I found myself once again at my kitchen table, but with invoices on one side and letters of thanks on the other. The world began to weigh itself differently in the scale of my days.
There were other human things, too. Awkward meetings where Pamela's name would float up like a ghost, an encounter in a grocery aisle where a mutual friend tried to act as a diplomat and left the conversation clumsy. A dinner with my children where we laughed in bursts and then went quiet in shared, private ways. All of it was real. I did not erase pain to make a catalog of achievements. I learned to carry both. Sometimes when I teach a workshop, I close my eyes and think of that night in September and the way the iPad chimed. I tell the group, the volunteers, the children, the grandchildren, that there is an honesty in being broken open and a responsibility in how you heal. People nod. Some cry. Someone will usually raise a hand and ask, "Did you ever reconcile with him?" That is a complicated question with a simple answer. Reconciliation is not always possible or healthy, and sometimes the best forgiveness is found in the way you build a life that refuses to be small. It's late afternoon when the phone rings now, and I look at the list of upcoming bookings and feel the familiar nervousness before something large. There is a draft of a proposal sitting on my desk and a pile of binders neatly labeled Dorothy, Johnson Family, Mendez. I place my hand lightly on the proposal and think of the first book. The first book changed everything, not in the way of a headline, but in the way a seed changes the soil. We watered it, we tended it, we made mistakes and learned. And when the world did finally offer a real opportunity to scale, that thing people later called a contract, we were ready enough to accept the work without abandoning the care. If you are sitting with a pain that feels like a permanent ache, please hear me. It does not have to define every hour of the rest of your life. You can choose, in small ways, to build something that matters. You can start with what you have, a tape recorder, a friend, a willingness to listen. It is not about proving anything to anyone. It is about proving to yourself that you still belong to the larger story. And yes,
If you stayed this long and want to hear more about what happened next, about the proposal that turned into a pilot and a call we never expected, about how a tiny company became a presence in multiple towns, leave a comment below. Tell me about your reinvention. Tell me what you have been afraid to try. The email that had asked about a pilot was just the beginning. Over the next month, calls multiplied, requests for pricing, meetings with activity directors, and a consultant who wanted to visit our site. One afternoon, as I was packing the prototype books for a delivery, the phone rang and the voice on the other end introduced herself as someone who managed programming for a chain of senior living facilities with locations across the state. She had a calm, corporate voice and an odd tenderness when she explained why she was calling.
She had found our segment online and wanted to know if Legacy Memories could be scaled beyond the pilot. I placed the last book, the one we had made for a veteran, into a padded envelope, and I looked around the small room that had become a workshop and a refuge. There was glue on the table, a mug with someone else's lipstick stain, the faint scent of lemon from the cleaners. It was nowhere near glamorous. It was very, very human. "Can you handle it?" Richard asked, folding a box flap with the precision of someone who had always worked with his hands. "I don't know yet," I said honestly, "but I want to try." He folded the box with a quiet resolution. Outside, a downpour began, the kind that would flatten the lake glass for a night. Inside, we sealed the last envelope and wrote the address in careful block letters. I walked out onto the porch and watched the rain hit the water, thinking about how small things, an iPad screenshot, a thermos of coffee, a tape recorder, had edged me toward a future that felt plausible and purposeful. The phone was still in my pocket. The inbox would not stop. The list of clients would grow. The work would demand more of me than I'd planned to give. And then the email came, the one that would later become a landmark in the story of Legacy Memories. I read it once, twice, and then called my children. They could hear the strain in my voice and asked me to breathe. I did. We had made a pact, Richard and I. Whatever came next, we would keep the work honest, and we would not use it as a club to beat anyone we had once loved. The contract, when it arrived, would be an opportunity to serve people on a larger scale. It would not be the revenge some imagined it to be. I did not, in that moment, understand how much would change, but I understood enough that the story I was living could outgrow the sorrow that began it. I understood that pain could be a starting point rather than a final chapter. I understood the strange grace of being pushed into a life I would not have chosen, and how the newness of that life required me to be brave in ways I had not expected. There is a call I have to make now, a meeting to schedule, and a list of people to train. There are binders to prepare and a proposal to revise. But there is also a quiet pleasure in the small things, the way Marcus taped the last photograph into its place with reverence, the way Richard brewed coffee without asking, the way my daughter sent a text with a picture of a new lamp for my living room, as if to say, "You deserve light." So I stand at the doorway of a moment that feels like a hinge. The phone has its messages, and the day has its orders. The work keeps arriving, unbidden and generous. The storm moves on, leaving the world sparkling and fresh. I fold a blanket, close the door, and listen. There will be challenges ahead. Scaling a business is not a clean story, but there will also be rooms full of people who want to be heard. And that, I think, is enough for now. The next step is to answer the call that came from a corporation that might want to place the hearts we bind into halls far beyond our county, an offer that could mean more work than we had ever imagined, and a choice about how to grow without losing the tenderness at our center. The weeks after we said yes to the pilot felt like waking into a new weather pattern. Suddenly, the calendar mattered. Meetings filled up like rain puddles, facility visits, training sessions, pilot timelines. We learned quickly that bringing intimacy to scale is less about charm than about mechanics, checklists that preserved moments, scripts that prompted memory without leading it, shipping schedules that didn't squash fragile albums. Richard became our operations man in earnest. He loved the logistics the way some people love gardening. Neat rows, predictable seasons. Marcus became our creative director, turning scanned images into pages that read like a conversation, not a catalog. I kept doing what I'd always done, asking people about their soup, about the song that made them dance,
about the ordinary bravery that stitches a life together. The pilot went better than we dared hope. Staff at the facilities learned our gentle way of asking questions. Families sent thank you notes that read like private prayers. We tracked metrics, not in the way venture capitalists do at first, but in return rates and repeat orders, in the number of families who asked for second copies for far-flung relatives. Those small indicators morphed into something larger, an RFP request from a regional office. It was a form letter at first, cold and corporate, but beneath its sterile language was an opportunity to open our work to a breadth of rooms and people we had only imagined. Negotiations with a corporate office are strange when you're used to kitchen tables. The language was precise and sometimes brutal. Service levels, delivery windows, staffing ratios. They wanted assurance that we could operate across dozens of sites and maintain the tenderness each client deserved. We wrote protocols. We created training modules that taught a way of listening, not to mine for drama, but to give permission to ordinary recollection. We hired more people, archivists who could coast a story from a halting voice, project managers who could think in timelines, binders who could make a hand-stitched page look as certain as a promise. We learned how to write an invoice that wasn't just polite, but defensible. There was a day I remember like a photograph, a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows, a sun-slick river below, and across the table a woman in a navy blazer who slid a contract toward me. The number sat on the first page, bold and blunt, $2.44 million over 3 years. It felt absurd to see it printed in a typeface that said this was official. My hands went to the paper like a child at a table who feels permission to touch the cake.
Richard put his hand over mine for a second, not squeezing, just a contact that said we were doing it together. We read the terms out loud, clause by clause. There were expectations we would meet and metrics we'd have to uphold. There were contingencies I had not imagined when we began, insurance riders and data protection addendums and staffing minimums. But mostly there was the bright, simple fact of commitment. They wanted us to bring legacy memories into halls where our work could be a routine part of life for hundreds, then thousands of residents. Signing that contract did not feel like a punitive act toward anyone. It felt instead like the world recognizing that what we had created mattered at scale. I kept the pen after I'd signed, more habit than symbolism, because I like to look at things I have touched. The contract went into a folder on which I wrote in my messy hand, kept. It was not gloating, it was a record. The hard work after signing looked like spreadsheets and training, followed by more spreadsheets. We rented a larger space, 10,000 square feet in an old brick building that smelled of dust and sunlight. Half of it became our digitization and binding floor, rows of stations where fingers could move with care. The other half became classrooms and a map room where we would plot delivery routes and calendar windows. We hired dozens of people over the next month, archive technicians, schedulers, drivers, customer service representatives. We learned to interview for empathy and to create onboarding that taught both procedure and heart. Scaling had its own bruises. Mistakes were inevitable. A shipment went to the wrong facility, and a family called to say they had been waiting. We cried on the phone with one woman who feared her father's voice would be lost. We stayed up all night reprinting replacements and drove boxes to her house ourselves. Those nights taught us what our commitment actually cost. They also taught us that the work was worth bending sleep for. We instituted a policy. If the work mattered enough to keep someone from losing a voice, it mattered enough for us to move mountains. There were moments of surprise, too. An unexpected large order came from a facility where one director had been a volunteer in our early days. She remembered Dorothy and the way our first book had held that woman's voice. A university contacted us, interested in a partnership for preserving oral histories. A nonprofit wanted to subsidize books for veterans. We began, slowly and carefully, to diversify our offerings while keeping the core promise intact. Stories told with respect and returned in a form a family could open and touch. When the press started to pay attention beyond our county, the inquiries changed tone. People who had only glimpsed our work on television or in an article called to ask about best practices and pricing.
The story of an older woman who'd been laughed and then built something from the pieces became a human interest thread that the media could follow. The arc was tidy and satisfying in headlines. But much of the real work stayed mercifully unglamorous, training a new battalion of interviewers to sit with silence, the small, exacting labor of color-correcting a faded tint so a sunburned sheet could be remembered in the right shade. Evaluation came after months of growing revenue streams and a strategic meeting with an investor group who wanted to join, not to take over.
They liked the model because it combined repeat revenue from corporate contracts with a mission that attracted donor support and grants. We did not chase investors, they found us. The number they quoted when they did their assessment, an $8.3 million valuation, sounded wildly larger than anything we had discussed at my kitchen table. "Don't let the size of that number change you," Richard said, touching my elbow like he had the day I signed the contract. "Let it let you do more good." And so we did more. We moved into the new facility, hired managers who could run teams without the founders watching every minute, and opened a satellite office that handled national accounts. The scope of what we were doing meant more travel, training sessions in neighboring states, speaking engagements, and eventually a short trip to a conference abroad where I was invited to speak about the work of listening. I had not planned to go on airplanes again the way I did before David left, yet there I was, passport in my drawer and a small carry-on with markers and cards, stepping into rooms where people wanted to know how a business that began at a kitchen table had held its soul. The contract transformed more than our office. It changed the arithmetic of my life. We had always reinvested, but the 3-year deal, $2.44 million, gave us the chance to pay fair wages, to hire long-term, to set aside funds for subsidized projects for low-income families. It allowed me, finally, to make practical choices: repairs to the roof, a new van for deliveries, funds to pay for an archivist to go speak at a community college. It also, candidly, allowed me to afford comforts I had long set aside. A house by the lake had been a dream that was half wistful hope and half vanity. We bought it not as a trophy, but as a place where clients could come and tell stories in sunlight if they wanted to. The house is modest in its way, large windows, a porch that faces the shimmer at dusk, and it has become, to my surprise, a harbor. I sometimes wake early, make coffee, and sit on the porch as the world lightens, and think about how the view feels earned. People expect a scene of triumph where I stand on a stoop and gloat, but life isn't a revenge movie. When David and Pamela's situation came up in conversation, I stayed measured.
Through mutual friends, I learned that they were struggling. Housing difficulties, financial strain, the quiet unraveling that comes when a new life was not the cure either of them imagined. They later separated. They were, for reasons I didn't pry into, not the same team they appeared to be in a courthouse selfie. I did not delight in their trouble. I felt a complicated pity and an odd relief. The life we build must be accountable to truth, and truth rarely looks like dramatic closure. Sometimes it looks like two people who cannot stay married to one another. That was theirs. There was a moment a year after the contract when David called. I saw his number on the phone, and for a second the old instinct, answer, be small, rose. He asked, haltingly, if I could help him find work. His voice sounded flat, like a page someone had smoothed with their thumb too often. I listened. I could have used the moment to make some grand statement about karma, but I didn't believe in that sort of satisfaction. "I'm sorry you're having a hard time," I said. "I have resources through our community job center. I can give you a contact." I offered a referral, not because I felt obligated, but because I did not want to be the kind of person who hoards help as punishment. Refusing to let bitterness govern my response felt more like justice than any novel restitution. He thanked me, and the call ended. It was, in its own small way, a clean closure. The years rolled on. Legacy Memories grew more robust in structure and more confident in heart. We introduced an online portal where families could order reprints and upload scanned images. We launched training programs for volunteers. We created a small foundation arm dedicated to making books affordable for people in low-income facilities. The numbers ticked upward, revenue from corporate contracts blended with private commissions and grants. Our valuation remained a signpost, a number people liked to mention at cocktail parties, but our daily work was in binding threads and listening to someone recall the smell of wood smoke on a childhood morning. There were days when the old hurt returned like a tide. On certain anniversaries, or when a song played that had once been our song, I would feel the dull, familiar lurch. Therapy helps, family helps, and work helps in a different way, by returning meaning to your minutes. I did not pretend to be wholly healed. I am not a before and after postcard. I am a person with seams, some neatly stitched and some still visible. I learned to live with the stitches in a way that made them part of my narrative rather than the only thing anyone could see. People started calling me for talks about resilience. They wanted an easy formula. Usually an easy formula reduces pain to a recipe, but my answer was always the same: small choices, daily commitments, and the willingness to be useful. I told audiences that if they wanted a blueprint, take the parts they could use, show up, listen, build something that answers a need.
Don't let the language in your head be, why me, but rather, what now? The answer will be different for everyone. For me, it was a business that held people's memories like soft cargo. There were ironies that pleased me quietly. David and Pamela, having separated, scraped along in ways that were not for me to watch, but for me to accept as part of the messy fallout of choices. I wasn't watching to gloat. Their difficulties were not a scoreboard that restored dignity. My satisfaction was private, a kind of moral ledge that said, I chose to build. The people who had dismissed me as simply an injured spouse began to ask whether perhaps whatever had happened was not the end for me at all, but an odd, painful beginning. At 72, the public parts of my life feel less important than the private ones. Marcus has a family now. He sends me pictures of his twin boys and jokes that their font choices will define an era. Richard and I still have our late-night planning sessions and our thermos ritual. Sometimes we will sit on the porch and humbly marvel at a curve in the ledger that once would have been incomprehensible. Dorothy passed a few years into our growth. She died with a copy of her book on her bedside table, and the family sent us a photo of it, open to a page she had loved. I keep that photo on my desk. The contract, the one that began as a 3-year, $2.44 million arrangement, has been renewed in parts and adjusted as the world changed. It was the turning point in a narrative I did not choose but was given. The valuation of $8.3 million is a number on paper that has given us room to do more good, to pay people better, to institute policies that keep the work tender even when the volume grows. It is also a reminder that a life can be remade without abandoning the self you were before the rupture. If there is a peculiar justice here, it's quiet and tidy in the ways that matter. Jobs for people who needed them, books that keep a grandmother's voice at family dinners, a small foundation that helps underfunded facilities preserve histories that would otherwise vanish. That ultimately is the keeping the contract meant to me. Not a victory parade, but the ability to keep on doing the thing that matters. People ask me what I would say to someone in the moment I was once in. The night I saw Pamela's courthouse photo, the hollowed-out ache after 42 years of marriage changed overnight. My answer has evolved. At first, I would have wanted to say something fierce about survival. Now I say, with more steadiness, that rage is natural and will sharpen your edges if you let it. But rage does not build. Insistence on purpose does. If you can move from, why was this done to me, to what can I create that matters, you have begun to reclaim your story.
And here's something practical I learned along the way. Small acts compound. Martha taught us that with a shoebox of letters. Dorothy taught us that a voice matters. Start with one small thing you can do tomorrow to make your life mean more to you. Call an old friend. Frame a photograph properly. Ask someone about the song that made them feel young. Those small practices, done faithfully, aggregate into a different life. I never wanted my story to be a manual for profit. I tell it because it contains a truth that has comforted many people who have come to me. Life is not sealed after betrayal. You can be 70 and begin a business. You can be 67 and find the courage to ask hard questions. You can fail and then make something that matters in response. That is not a promise of riches. It is a promise of possibility. There are days when I still pass the courthouse where Pamela once took that photograph. I walk on the other side of town when the weather is sharp because I prefer not to sit in the theater of other people's lives. But there was a time when I would have wanted to announce my success from a rooftop. Now I am content with quieter satisfactions. A team that cares, books on a shelf, a foundation that helps a lonely veteran find his voice. I like my porch and my garden, and the way the house looks in the evening when the lake turns gold. If you are sitting with the aftermath of a betrayal, know this: holding on to pain will not repay you. Building something does not erase what happened, but it creates a counterweight that lets you breathe. You don't need a grand plan. Begin where you can. Keep your hands busy in ways that honor your values. Talk to people who will sit and listen. Ask for help when you must. If the world offers a contract, literal or metaphorical, make sure it is one you keep because it allows you to do the work you were born to do, not because it will prove anything to anyone else. I kept the contract. I kept more than a signature. I kept my promise to the people whose lives we touch. We took what hurt me and turned it outward into work that helps preserve lives so they can be held by those who come after. That is the kind of justice that doesn't humiliate, it repairs. If this story speaks to you, tell me below. Share your reinvention.
Tell us what small thing you started that shifted the weight of your days. If you want to hear more stories like this, about late reinvention, quiet triumphs, and the practical work of building compassion at scale, follow along. Your best chapter might be waiting on the other side of your worst heartbreak.